Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast. We cover everything Major League, from spring training to the World Series. We've got your favorite club covered, from New York to Boston to LA. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Ridenauer, and we've got a really wonderful show ahead of us today. I hope everyone has been doing well and has slowly gotten back into some sort of normal routine after the holiday. I know after holidays it's always kind of a challenge to get back into the swing of things, but I'm hoping that everybody's been able to do that in a very smooth fashion and really had a nice transition back into the work week after the holiday. Not sure if anyone went Black Friday shopping. I stayed away from malls and I didn't do any deal hunting. I needed to save some money for Christmas, and I know I should have probably done some of my Christmas shopping during the Black Friday, but I've heard people have had a very hard time purchasing anything online since everyone is doing it at the same time, and then some malls are and then aren't closed, and you don't know how far the ones that are open are, and it's just a big old mess. So I just figured I'd wait on the Christmas shopping, which is actually kind of crazy to think about, that Christmas is only a few weeks away. I mean, we just got out of Thanksgiving, and again, that's kind of the holiday season for you, one after the other. But anyways, getting into today's show, there's a lot I want to discuss and cover, and we've got some great topics to highlight. So I'll first get into some of the latest news going around the MLB. I'll discuss some recent updates in the baseball world, from the MLB's new Wood Bat League for prospects to any of the recent trade and free agency news. I'll be sure to touch on all of that. After our news-filled first segment, I'll move into discussing which big-name free agent can make the best case for the best contract. I'll select some of the biggest-name free agents and give reasons as to which one can earn the largest contract. Later on, I'll discuss the most memorable three-team trades over the last few years. I'll discuss the teams that were involved, which players were the big-time names involved in the trade, and also who walked away the winners and losers of those trades. And be sure to stick around for the final few minutes of the show today, as I will continue on that trend of trade talking, as I will get into discussing the worst trades over the last few seasons. I'll mention which trades really stuck out to me as just absolutely disappointing for one team or another, and which trades still rank among the worst of all time in the MLB. So I'll touch on some from previous years, from many, many years ago, that really are infamous trades that had a lot to do with kind of the outcome of some of these franchises for years to come. So I'll get into all of that in a little bit, but I want to first, again, stay in this first segment, and I want to jump into some news involving baseball prospects and some of the initiatives being taken by the MLB to help prospects get seen and really get exposure in front of MLB teams. So recently, within the last week or so, the MLB has now implemented their new Wood Bat League. And what this is basically going to be is kind of an outlet or a way for prospects who are, again, now we're not able to have, minor league prospects as much, can't have as many of them, mainly because 40 plus teams have been nixed and have been pretty much dismantled, if you will, in the last year or two. So now what they're trying to do is they're trying to correct that kind of and still give an opportunity to prospects to try and get seen by scouts and by MLB teams. So this Wood Bat League is going to be for high school players that are wanting to enter the draft, college players that want to enter the draft, and then junior college players also. And it's going to be a 68-game season, I believe. And what they're going to do is they're going to have pretty much as one whole season, but it's split into two halves. And the midway point will be an all-star break, obviously. And what they're trying to do is have that coincide with the College World Series and the MLB Draft. And the point of that is, if anybody that is in college that doesn't get selected in the draft, or anybody that is in the College World Series that, is thinking about leaving early and wants to get some exposure and wants to get seen by teams, then they can actually, in the second half of the Wood Bat League, go and join a team. And they can then obviously get seen and can get exposure in front of these scouts. So it's a great opportunity for players that I'm sure within the last couple months have been really worried if they'll ever get the shot to actually get seen by MLB teams. Well, now that question and kind of that worry has been answered and solved a little bit, because this is going to be an opportunity for players to get more exposure and just added reps in front of these, teams that have numerous scouts coming to games, trying to see, who knows, you might find the next big name in this wood bat league. And the other thing about this is, with all the teams that have been, kind of dismantled and nixed, and the 40 teams that don't exist anymore in the minor league farm system, now what they're trying to do is they're trying to bring about teams in this wood bat league into areas that have lost teams over the last few years, or that baseball has become pretty much obsolete in those said areas. They're trying to broaden the community of baseball in America, and I think that's what is a very great thing also. I think that's going to really open doors for not only players to have an opportunity to be seen, but, again, jobs. People are able to go in and see games, some local entertainment for people. It can do a lot of wonderful things. And some of the areas like in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, New Jersey, just a couple states that are really trying to make that push for this wood bat league and trying to get teams into this area or into those areas. I'm pretty sure actually in Pennsylvania, I think it's going to be the State College Spikes, if I'm not mistaken. That's going to be the name of a team that I think was at one point or another a team, and then it went defunct, and then now they're going to try and bring it back through this wood bat league. But this is going to be great for players to get exposure, obviously, and not to mention showcase their skills, but they can also get used to using a wood bat, and that is going to really, I think, be the difference maker in how these college guys coming out of college, they can adjust to that wood bat style of play as opposed to the aluminum style of play and hitting, really. So I think it's going to be a very interesting kind of next couple years to see how this wood bat league kind of unfolds and is kind of put together. And again, it's not going to be teams that are going to necessarily be associated with MLB teams. These will pretty much be, from what I understood, just kind of teams that are in this league that is owned by the MLB. So they're essentially just MLB minor league teams. They're not affiliated teams. So again, it'll be pretty, actually, I think, beneficial for some of these players, because then they can be seen by not just the scouts in, when you're in an affiliated system, all you can see is the scouts from, the teams above you, the AA team for the Angels and then the AAA team for the Angels, and then the Angels will send scouts. You're not really seeing scouts from the Dodgers and the Mariners and the Rockies coming to those games, because that's not their affiliated team. But now with this wood bat league, it opens up the pool of scouts that can go see players, and the abundance of opportunities that there are now for players to be seen by all of these different scouts. So I think it's going to be a really great thing. I'm really excited to see how it kind of unfolds, and who knows? I mean, if there's a team that pops up around where I live in Pittsburgh, I would love to go see a game. I mean, I don't live that far from State College. It's about a 2-hour drive, I guess, but I'd still make it with friends, a weekend trip. Why not? Whenever that actually happens, and whenever we can go back to seeing the games, because who knows when that'll be. But anyways, sticking with the minor leagues and talking about minor league baseball, there's also been some other recent news, and that is that the Pioneer League became yet again another minor league affiliate to become a partner league with the MLB. So very similar to the Atlantic League, the American Association, and the Frontier League, the Pioneer League, which at one point was an independent league, is now, just like those other three leagues that I mentioned, they are now part of the MLB partnership, and now they're another partner league. And again, going back to the Wood Bat League, I think that this is going to open up doors for a lot of players that are probably shaking in their boots right now, wondering, am I going to be able to get seen? The draft has gone from 40 rounds to 5 rounds. So that's 35 rounds gone. And think about all of those players that are now not going to be able to be seen or even have a shot because they're not in that top tier, 5-round draft kind of pool of players. Now you've got these partner leagues, you've got this Wood Bat League. There's other ways that players, and they're really trying to, I think, revolutionize, prospect baseball and scouting baseball. Because what the MLB is doing, very similar to the Atlantic and American and Frontier leagues, is they're going to start implementing and installing state-of-the-art technology for these MLB teams to then have access to any sort of game film, any sort of game clips, whatever they need on prospects, and they're going to be able to have that at their disposal, and they're going to be able to have that in all sorts of different leagues, all sorts of different ballparks, and I think that's going to really, be a huge, huge door opener for a lot of players. Not to mention, going back to, with the Wood Bat League and bringing baseball into communities that don't have baseball, that's what the Pioneer League is also going to do, because they're really trying to get baseball to expand outward into the West and into, really untapped markets. I mean, they talked about Idaho, Montana, Utah, Colorado, places where, again, population is probably not the largest in Idaho and Montana and places like that, but there's definitely a need for small market minor league teams that can pop up in areas around there, and then people can go see games. They can go see professional sporting events. They can go see those things where in otherwise they wouldn't really be able to see that because there's no pro teams in Idaho or Montana. Now there are in Utah and in Colorado, but in some of these other states, not so much. And I think that's, again, a big one-up for the MLB, showing that they're trying to fix something that is going on with the minor league system. They're trying to correct it. Again, they're trying to revolutionize it, and they're really trying to see how they can change it for the better. And I think that being able to kind of modernize not only baseball scouting through this technology, but also just modernize how watching prospects are going to be in the future. You're not going to have these large affiliated farm systems. You're going to have these little kind of developmental leagues popping up all around the U.S. that are essentially going to just replace those extra 2 or 3 teams that, in all honesty, were probably not that needed. And not to mention, again, it goes back to what kind of job opportunities does this create for people? What type of entertainment does this provide for the community? What type of opportunities does it provide for, really just everybody in the area? And so I think that there's a lot of positives that can come out of not only the Wood Bat League, but also now the Pioneer League being partnered with the MLB. So some really great stuff on the horizon, I think, for minor league baseball and just prospect baseball. I'm personally really excited about it. But I want to kind of move out of minor league and get into some, more kind of pertinent news and talk about some free agency and stuff like that. Recently, there's been a few more moves, again, being made by teams, but in particular, it's been the Kansas City Royals who have been really starting to make the headlines with the addition of 2 new players to their roster. So they recently signed Michael A. Taylor, former outfielder for the Washington Nationals, on a 1-year, $1.75 million deal. And then I think he got a $1 million incentive bonus. I'm guessing whatever is in his contract, whatever those incentives are, they could add out to $1 million. But I don't know if that's going to actually happen, mainly because of this. Again, being a D.C. local, you grow up watching Nationals baseball, and I grew up watching Michael A. Taylor. Well, everybody that's a Nats fan where I live, and I actually at one point or another was an intern for the Nationals, everybody would joke and call Michael A. Taylor Michael K. Taylor, mainly because he would strike out all the time. Now, I think the Royals were smart in going after getting a very defensive-oriented outfielder in Michael A. Taylor. I think that he is pretty solid with the glove. He's very fast, covers a lot of ground. But again, the hitting is very inconsistent. I mean, you've got 1 year he could be doing all right. The next year he could not be doing so well. And he's a career .237 hitter. I mean, he batted .196 last year. So clearly not on a great trend, and I'm sure that's what they were hoping. They could get a player with a lot of promise for a very, very low, cost, and they did on a 1 year, not even $2 million deal. But at the same time, it's, what could have they done with that money otherwise? They could have maybe gone after somebody that was actually, a little bit more productive from the plate, was a little bit more, I don't want to say dominant, but just played a little bit better overall offensively. And again, for a team that was dead last just about in the AL Central, they were not one of the better hitting teams. I really think that they could have gone after somebody that brought a little bit more of a heavy bat into the lineup. Now, they also did go after some pitching. They added Mike Minor, who pitched for the Royals actually in 2017, and he pitched very well for them in a previous stint. I mean, he had a 2.55 ERA. But what's interesting about Minor is he can not only be a starter, he could also move into the bullpen and into a kind of a relief role. Because, Greg Holland, who knows what's going to happen with him? I mean, he's their closer now. He's a free agent. And if he decides to walk and move on from the Royals, Mike Minor could just slide right on into being a new, closer for the Royals. I mean, he's on a 2-year deal, so he'll be there for a little bit. But I just think that, again, the Michael A. Taylor, I'm not quite sure about that move. I just didn't. When I saw that, I was like, I don't know if I like that. Because if he doesn't bring that great of a bat, and if he's only going to be really a defensive presence, you've got to take when you're in the lineup, and when you're looking at the lineup, you've got to take that into consideration. Okay, Michael A. Taylor, 8 out of 10 times, 9 out of 10 times, is not going to get on base, but he overcompensates for it by being a good fielder. So I'm intrigued to see how that will work out, but I think Mike Minor is going to be a nice addition for them. And even if Greg Holland does wind up re-signing, they could still use him as a starter. I mean, they are looking for reliable starting pitching, and not to mention, he's versatile. You can move him into the bullpen, so who knows, maybe they just put him as a reliever whatever might happen, I think the Royals they're trying to make some moves. I mean, their front office has obviously been successful in the past. I mean, they went to 2 straight World Series in the 2010s. They won one of those. So clearly, whoever is kind of in charge and is making those decisions, they know what they're doing. But it's just whether or not these 2 moves are going to actually work out. I'm intrigued about the Michael A. Taylor move, but I'm pretty excited to see how Mike Minor kind of works out in Kansas City. So I want to now continue on with some of this free agency talk because, again, there continues to be so much news surrounding where Trevor Bauer will go. And I was reading an article on MLB.com, and it discussed kind of the what if it were to kind of unfold that Trevor Bauer landed on the Red Sox and what could really unfold after that and what kind of the domino effect would be after that. And what would, first off, I mean, I've mentioned this before on the show, what would happen is the Red Sox would get arguably a top 5 pitcher this past year. Well, technically in the NL, he was the best pitcher because he won the Cy Young, but overall in the MLB, probably, number for number and just career for career, like stacking his career up against some of the other top-tier pitchers in the MLB, he's probably a top 5, top 10 pitcher in the last couple years, and at least in this past year. So you're going to be adding what would normally be an ace on probably 85% of the teams on the MLB because Chris Sale is already the ace for the Red Sox, and in my opinion, Chris Sale is a better pitcher than Trevor Bauer. I wouldn't say by, leaps and bounds, but I would say by, a decent bit that he is a better pitcher. But Chris Sale being that ace and then Trevor Bauer is your number 2 option, that's not too shabby of a rotation. That's not too bad of a 1-2 punch. And I think that is what is really intriguing about Bauer is that he's got ace potential and he has ace ability, but if you add him to some of these contending teams, he's a second option. And I think that's what's going to make some of these teams so much more dangerous is that depth in pitching goes so much deeper adding somebody like Trevor Bauer. And not to mention, they'll also have Eduardo Rodriguez back. I mean, he's coming off of some COVID complications this past season and whatever else. And so as a result, you've got pretty solid top 3 guys, and you kind of trickle in anybody else to fill in the blanks from there, and you've got a pretty well-rounded pitching staff. So I think that being, the Red Sox going after Trevor Bauer would actually be very advisable. Now, I did have a couple friends come up to me and say, well, why would you have Bauer go to the Red Sox? He doesn't really fit their kind of the culture there. And I said, well, what do you mean by the culture? They said, well, the Red Sox, they're very business-oriented. They want you to go about your business in a professional way. And Bauer is very in the limelight. Off the field, he's texting, he's tweeting. He is kind of a personality on social media, this, that, and the other. He's a little bit of a distraction off the field. And I get that. Sure, he's totally a distraction off the field. But the Red Sox have also had very character-oriented players in the past that had very, outspoken, very vocal personalities. I mean, David Ortiz. Now, I wouldn't say David Ortiz is to the level that Trevor Bauer is in terms of, tweeting all this, that, and the other about where he's going to go and hinting at where he should wind up and stuff like that. David Ortiz never did that. But he was a loud, big personality, really well liked by everybody in Boston. So they know how to deal with players that have large personalities, and that is definitely Trevor Bauer. Regardless, I think he would be an incredible get for them. But this brings into my point of what will transpire after that? Because there's numerous second-tier pitchers that are also free agents because Bauer is leaps and bounds the best free agent pitcher this year. No question about it. But there's some guys that are, again, right below him in a tier below that are also very good and that could be huge adds for any team. I mean, you've got Jake Odorizzi. He's been very good for, playing with the Twins. You've got James Paxton, who is coming off a year with the Yankees. Masahiro Tanaka, also with the Yankees. Corey Kluber, Jose Quintana, J.A. Happ. All these guys are free agents this upcoming year. Or actually, right now. They're all free agents right now. And so, as a result, I think that it would be, it would behoove a lot of teams to take kind of a deeper look into some of these second-tier guys, especially some of these mid-market teams that they have no shot of getting him. Well, I wouldn't say that because Trevor Bauer has opened the door for anybody and everybody to go after him because he's willing to sign one-year deals for the rest of his career. But the real thing is, how is this going to kind of, unfold for, some of these second-tier guys, some of these guys that are not, a Trevor Bauer or a Jacob DeGrom or whomever it might be. Guy like James Paxton, perfect example. Getting a little bit older, he's approaching into his mid-30s just about, and he had an okay 2020 year. I mean, he was 1-1. He had a 6.64 ERA, so not great in that term. 20 and a third innings worked, 26 Ks, 7 walks, and he wasn't sensational. He wasn't anything great, but I will say, what's interesting about him is that this was his first year his ERA has ever really gone above 4 in his career, and he had 3 straight double-digit win seasons and 3 straight 150-plus K seasons the last 3 years. So the last 3 years he's actually been pretty solid. He's been kind of just a very steady starting pitcher. Same thing with Jake Odorizzi. I think he's been pretty solid for the most part. He's been an all-star. He compiled at least 10 wins in 3 of his last 5 seasons, and he had a career high in wins in 2019 with 15. So he's just about a year removed from that big season. He was 0-1 this past year, had a 6.59 ERA. So again, not great numbers, very similar to Paxton. And I think that's definitely going to hurt possibly his stock a little bit, but I don't want to, speak too soon on that because he's not that far removed from having a career season. So there could be a lot of value in Odorizzi. And again, Paxton's getting a little bit older. I mean, Odorizzi is 30 years old, and I'm pretty sure Paxton's about 34, 35. So they definitely have a couple years, in difference between each other that, or I should say Paxton's actually 32. So only about a 2-year difference, but still, I think that there are things about these two that could be very interesting. Masahiro Tanaka, same thing. I mean, he's been very, very consistent. 2-time All-Star. He's actually never won fewer than 11 games in a season, and he never has had a losing record either. So he wins. He's a winning pitcher. He was 3-3 this past season. He had a 3.56 ERA, 44 Ks, he had 120 ERA plus. So a guy that does a pretty nice job from the mound. You also have Corey Kluber. Didn't really do a whole lot this year. I mean, he only had 1 start. I'm pretty sure he was a little injury-ridden. He had, again, 0-0 record. He only had 1 K. He only worked 1 inning. But he's a 3-time All-Star. He's never won fewer than 18 games from 2016 to 2018. And then he's also won 18 or more games in 4 of his 10 years in the league. So he's, again, another winning pitcher. So I think Tanaka and Kluber are going to be 2 guys that teams are going to really take into consideration a little bit. Jose Quintana, same thing. I think he's another guy that would be interesting to see where he winds up. And then J.A. Happ, the same thing. But J.A. Happ, honestly, is a little bit older. I think that he's one of the older guys on this list. And I think that, it kind of, that's going to take away from his value a little bit. 38 years old, definitely on the tail end of his career. He's had a pretty solid, steady career for the most part. 1-time All-Star. He had 20 wins in 2016, and he's actually had 8 of his 14 years in the league have double-digit win seasons. So over half of his career, he's been in the win column, or he's been above 500 as a pitcher. So not too shabby at all. But I think that, Kluber and Tanaka are going to be 2 pitchers to definitely watch after Bauer goes, and it'll be, I think, again, it'll be a very quick chain reaction in terms of once Bauer goes, who's going to be the next 2 or 3 to go in line, because after that, pitchers are going to be, a high commodity because, again, there's not many other big-time names on this free agent market for the pitchers except for Trevor Bauer. So I'm curious to see how these guys are going to kind of, make their way onto new teams and who's going to sign them where and whatnot. But it's going to be a very interesting offseason, and we've already seen kind of the intrigue so far in this free agency frenzy. And, hey, you know what? Christmas is just around the corner, so that means one thing and one thing only. We are not done with this free agency news, and there is still some big news to come. I'm already 100% certain on that, and I am very excited to reveal that news once it does come out. So that'll do it for us in this first segment, but stay right there, folks, because after the commercial, I'll mention which MLB free agent has the best chance at making the most amount of money this offseason. Folks, stay right there. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA, to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenour with you all, and in our first segment, I jumped right into some of the latest news in the MLB, but be sure to, again, stick around for the final segment today where I will highlight some of the worst trades in baseball history and which transactions have been the worst of the worst over the last few years. I want to now get into discussing which major free agents have the best case to make in trying to earn the best contract for themselves this offseason. So I want to jump into some of these big-name free agents and mention who has really, made a case for some big-time money. So the first one I want to mention, obviously, DJ LeMahieu, because he has been on a tear the last couple years. I mean, he's a three-time All-Star, and in the last 5 years, again, that's really where he's kind of exploded onto the scene. And he's actually, fun fact, batted above .310 in 4 of the last 5 years. So in terms of second baseman and hitting, he's one of the best. And not to mention, he's got a great glove over at second base, so you're really getting the best of both worlds if you go after somebody like LeMahieu. He's also had a career high this past season in OPS. He had the league high in a batting average, which I also think was a career high for him. And not to mention, he had an AL high in OBP as well. And he had an AL high in OPS. So his numbers across the board this year were prime numbers to have for going into free agency and going into an offseason and saying, hey, I'm able to make this case. I led the entire AL in 3 categories, and I also had the best batting average in the entire MLB. Not to mention, he had 10 homers and 27 RBIs. So his offensive production is incredibly key. And I know I've mentioned a couple teams that could see, they could potentially go after and try and get DJ LeMahieu. Obviously, the Mets have become really one of the top names now with Robinson Cano being suspended for all of next year. But he's definitely made a case for, some big-time money the last few years. Not to mention, he's had 4 straight years with 60-plus RBIs. He had a career-high 102 RBIs in 2019. So he's capable of those big-time offensive numbers. There's no question about it. I will say, though, he's approaching his mid-30s. So the question will be, how long will his contract be? How many years is he going to get? Is he going to get a deal that is way out of bounds and just absolutely abnormal for somebody that old? I mean, he's around 33, 32, somewhere around there. So you think, okay, he's probably got at least 3-4 still really solid years left in him. Is that going to actually happen, though? Because, in all honesty, we've seen it many times. One little injury, and it just derails somebody's career completely. So I think that you have to take that into consideration if you're a team looking at him. His age is definitely going to be a factor. But in terms of numbers, I mean, the guy has clearly made a case. I mean, he had a 421 OBP this past year, had over 1,000 OPS, had a 177 OPS plus. I mean, there's not much more you can say about the guy that is negative, in my opinion. So DJ LeMahieu, I think, has made a very good case for himself. It's just going to be a matter of his age, and if a team wants to take a long-term gamble on somebody that is approaching into some, later years into his career. So the next player I want to get into, obviously another really big name, Trevor Bauer. And talk about a guy who had a career year. I mean, this guy literally, I think, put himself into a 10 times better situation than what he was coming out of last year in his, first half season, if you will, at Cincinnati. I mean, his ERA jumped from a little bit over 3 when he was in Cleveland to then when he went to Cincinnati midway through the season, it jumped up to over 6. So if he was a free agent last year, would not have probably gotten a great deal. I mean, he probably would have still gotten a really good deal because he is still a very good pitcher, but definitely not the deal that he is going to get this upcoming year. I mean, he's definitely within a great age range. He's not too old, not too young. He's right in the prime of his career, so he's going to be ideal for a lot of teams to have. He had a career high in ERA this past year. He won his first Cy Young. He had a career high ERA plus. I mean, his ERA plus was through the roof. It was an NL high. If I'm not mistaken, it might have been an MLB high also, 276. And if you've got an ERA plus, they say usually the benchmark's about 100. So he's 176, almost 200 points higher than just the league average. Pretty outstanding, if you ask me. So I think he's definitely going to be a big-time name. He's definitely going to be somebody that's going to get a lot of money this offseason. Plus, he's had some big-time 200-plus K seasons. I mean, he's obviously a high strikeout guy, one of 3 guys this entire year that had over 100 strikeouts. And he he was second in the NL behind Jacob deGrom in that category as well. So somebody that is going to get outs for you. And I go back to this playoff game that he started, the one lone playoff game he started for the Reds this past year, because he looked sensational. And I think that had to have been a little bit of, I don't want to call it a tryout, but almost kind of an exhibit of his talent and an exhibition of his ability to kind of see and gauge how he does with the limelight on him, with all the attention, all the spotlight on him being on ESPN, being in the playoffs, going up against a division winner in the Atlanta Braves. And he held his own. He actually dominated, in my opinion. I mean, struck out 12, went 7 strong innings, didn't walk anybody, I don't think. So those numbers right there, I think a lot of teams were, if they weren't already paying attention, they definitely started to after that game, because I for certain was 100% sold on him from, the midway point of this year on, but especially in, this past playoffs when he started that one lone game, I really went kind of all in with Trevor Bauer, because he can add some serious power to any rotation. I know in the last segment I had mentioned that MLB.com had discussed possibly him going to the Red Sox. Who knows where he'll land, right? I mean, anywhere he could go anywhere. And I think that's another intriguing thing about him. I've mentioned it before. He's kind of revolutionized the idea of free agency, because he says, I want to just sign with whomever, and I will sign one-year contracts for the rest of my life. I don't know if that'll really benefit him in the long run, and I don't think he'll actually do that. He's definitely going to land on a contending team, or at least a team in a large market that has a lot of money. I know that the Angels have actually become a place where he might wind up because of his local ties. He's originally from California. I believe he's really originally from Los Angeles, and not to mention he went to UCLA. So I think that would also possibly be a factor in everything, but who knows what's going to happen. I mean, his record this past year wasn't outstanding. I mean, he was 5-4, but with a 1.73 ERA, he had 100 Ks in 73 innings, and he only had 17 walks. So when you look at that record, it's telling me he's not getting a whole lot of run support, because he's clearly putting up numbers that most pitchers, if they were putting up on a decent team that had good hitting, they would at least have 7-8 wins. A couple of those losses would definitely turn into wins for him. And I think that is also a big thing. If you put him on a team that's going to give him run production and run protection, he's going to be really good. And again, you're basically getting an ace quality pitcher. And on some of these teams that have been in talks of wanting to get him, he would be a second option. So just think about the magnitude that would be of having somebody that talented on the same team as somebody that's already an ace. Pretty scary to think about for any hitter that would face off against whatever team that he's going up against. So obviously Trevor Bauer has made a very big push and a great cause and case really for him earning a lot of money. JT Royal Muto, again, another name. I mean, this is an interesting case because he's such a high demand player, because he's a rare commodity, right? He is, especially in this day in baseball, he's a catcher that can both hit for power and very good defensive catcher. And you don't really have a ton of those in the MLB. So it's very rare to find that, and I think that's what's going to be so intriguing about JT Real Muto. Not to mention, he's been very, very good in terms of hitting numbers. I mean, he had the best hitting numbers out of all catchers this year. I'm pretty sure he led all catchers in home runs, RBIs, OPS, OPS plus. I mean, he had a career high OPS this past year at 840. He did bat 266, so not great, but if you're batting 266 and you've got an 840 OPS, 900 OPS, in baseball today, those are actually really good numbers. So, I mean, I wasn't too disappointed in that kind of outing from him this past year. Obviously not the year that you would expect from somebody that's entering free agency, and he's this highly talked about, but he still has made a case at least the last couple years. I mean, he's in 2019, he led the MLB in caught stealing percent, and then he was also fourth in that same category the year before. So again, great defensive catcher, great offensive catcher, and I don't think any team could turn him down or would want to turn him down, because not many teams have a catcher that are doing or that is doing the same thing that JT Real Muto is doing, both catching, defensive catching and offensive hitting. Not to mention, he's 29, so he's got some time ahead of him. I think that he would definitely be another guy that could potentially get a longer deal than somebody like a DJ LeMahieu, because his age is very ideal right now. And you look at it, guys like Molina. I mean, Yadier Molina is 38 years old. So you think about if JT Real Muto was kind of on that career trajectory and kind of that career path that Molina has been on, he's got another 9 years left in him, maybe even 10, who knows. So you could definitely see him being signed to maybe a contending team for a long-term deal. I definitely think that he would probably make more money than LeMahieu would, again, because of his age and his rarity as a very good defensive and hitting catcher. but I don't know if he would make as much money as Trevor Bauer. I mean, Bauer being the reigning Cy Young, he's going to have a whole lot of pull in that, and I just really don't see how, in any sort of reality, how Trevor Bauer would not make more money than Royal Muto. I have a hard time seeing that. Again, unless some team is willing to throw that much at him, and he is capable of making that because there's not many catchers like him in the league. So it'll be interesting, for the most part, where he'll wind up and where he's going to go. But what I'm really excited about is this next guy, and that's George Springer, because he's another guy that he only batted .265 this year, but he had an .899 OPS, 14 homers, 32 RBIs, and great defensive catcher, great offensive catcher. That's exactly what you want. That's exactly what, or not catcher, outfielder. I'm sorry. I don't know what I'm thinking about. Obviously, I'm thinking about JT Realmuto, who I just finished talking about. Great offensive outfielder, great defensive outfielder, not to mention he's got great power hitting numbers. And I think that is going to be a very interesting and intriguing thing for a lot of teams, not to mention he's been on contending teams before. He's been on winning ball clubs. He's been to a World Series. He's won a World Series. So that's also an added kind of thing that you know for a fact that he's going to be a big-time piece for some team's success. And I think that's what's so intriguing about him is that he's got that championship-level experience that some of these other free agents don't have. I mean, Trevor Bauer doesn't have any of it. JT Realmuto doesn't have any of it. DJ LeMahieu doesn't have any of it. I'm going to spoil the rest of this list, but Jackie Bradley Jr., he does have some. I'm pretty sure. But Marcelo Zuna doesn't have any of it. So having George Springer bring in that veteran leadership, somebody that's been around at championship-level teams, I think that's really going to be impactful for his contract that he can earn and the amount of money that he can get from some teams. What I do kind of worry about is his inconsistency, because his numbers did greatly fluctuate from 2018 to 2020. In 2018, his average was actually what it was this past year at 265, but then in 2019, he jumped up to 292. So he went up about 30 points from one year to the next, and then from the next year after, he went down 30 points. So that up and down kind of play might be a little bit of a worry, not to mention he is getting into his 30s, so that does have to be some sort of a factor. But I think that, however much money people are going to pay him, I think that he's going to, he's going to be a bang for your buck. He's going to be very productive, I think, for the long term, and not to mention he's just got great power numbers, and I think that's another thing to go back to because that's what really baseball is in this day and age, at least. So I'm really curious to see kind of where he's going to land. And then obviously the next guy, another outfielder, like I mentioned, Jackie Bradley Jr. What is interesting about him is he brings so much defense to the plate. And I think that he's going to be, for teams that really struggle defensively in the outfield, they're going to have no problem throwing a lot of money at him because he did put up some pretty solid numbers. I mean, he had 7 homers and 22 RBIs, not usually a great hitter, and I think that's going to be a worry for a lot of these teams, is that he's not a great guy at the plate, but he batted .283 this year, so he had a higher average than Royal Muto and then George Springer. He had an .814 OPS, which is actually the first year since 2016 where his OPS was above 800. And fun fact about that was a year he was an all-star. So that goes to show you when he's at his best power hitting-wise and really hitting in general, he can be a top-tier outfielder because the defense is there. I mean, he's always been a very good fielder. He covers a lot of ground, and he's patrolled the center field for the Red Sox for many, many years. And I think somebody like the Indians, who've obviously struggled greatly with their power hitting outfielders and really have just kind of been an uphill battle with that. I think that they would be interesting. I know that they said that they wanted to save money, so he might not make as much money as some of these other guys will, but if he lands on the right team, he might. I mean, another team that could maybe go after him is the Detroit Tigers. They had a lot of holes in their outfield. Some guys were getting injured. I know Jacoby Jones is out there in the outfield already, but he's definitely battled some injuries. At least this past year he did. So some of these teams might try and make this move just to be a little bit competitive, and I'm very, very curious to see what team Jackie Bradley Jr. lands on. I don't know if he'll land on a contending team because I don't know if anybody's going to want to pay him as much as some of these other guys are going to get paid because some of these guys are going to get paid a large sum of money. So the next guy that I think has made a very good case that I'm very curious to see kind of where he winds up is Marcelo Zuna, obviously. I mean, he was part of probably the best two-man tandem in baseball with him and Freddie Freeman. And, I mean, he's had as many as 10 teams show interest in him, and he's going to get a lot of money. But I'm curious about if the universal DH does go to the NL, if that's going to continue to open more doors for him, or if it doesn't go universal and it just stays in the AL, could that shrink down on the opportunities or the possibilities of him possibly being, with just staying in the AL, or because he was in the NL this past year. So I'm not quite sure if, not having any DH positioning in the NL could affect that in any sort of regard. And then if that does, again, similar to Nelson Cruz kind of, who's another guy that made a big case for his free agency this upcoming offseason. But if there's no DH in the NL, that limits how many people and how many suitors would want to go after him. And I think that it could just turn straight over into the AL for Marcelo Zuna. And I think that would be very interesting for him to go over to. And I think that no matter what, he's going to get a lot of money. He had incredible numbers. He had an NL high in home runs in 18. He had 56 RBIs. That was an NL high. He had career highs in average, OBP, slugging, OPS, and OPS plus. He literally had the best year, in my opinion, career-wise, out of all of these guys on this list. So that leads me into who I think is going to get paid the most. Call me crazy, but I think it's going to be Ozuna. He's got the best case to make. Obviously, factoring in the universal DH is going to have a little bit to do with it, but I think that ultimately, wherever he lands, they're going to be able to stick him somewhere because he's not that bad of a fielder. He won a Gold Glove in 2017, so he's capable of fielding. It's just he obviously is much better at focusing in on hitting. So I'm just going to see kind of where he's going to land and if it's going to be AL or NL, and a lot of it's going to depend on where the DH lands, if it's just staying in the AL next year or if it goes universal. But I think that across the board, Ozuna's numbers were leaps and bounds higher in his career this past season than a lot of other guys. But then, again, Royal Muto is a rare commodity, and Trevor Bauer obviously made a big case for him winning the Cy Young. So who I think is going to get paid the most out of all of them is made the best case is Marcelo Zuna. Having all those career numbers, his power hitting ability, and just his ability at the plate. Right there. That should tell you a lot. Coming in at second, it's got to be Trevor Bauer. The NL Cy Young winner, he also had a lot of career highs, and just showing his sheer dominance on the mound. That should go to show you a lot of different things also. And then third, JT Realmuto, because he's very rare to find in the MLB, and I think that he's going to be a nice piece anywhere he goes, because really anybody is going to benefit from having a catcher that does both. So Ozuna's going to probably make the most, Bauer, and then Realmuto. I think that Mayhew and Springer, they're kind of getting up in age, so I don't think they'll make as much money. And then Jackie Bradley Jr., just the inconsistency offensively, I think kind of is a little bit worrisome for a lot of teams. So I think that'll steer them from paying him a large amount of money. But if he lands on a team, like a mid-market team, he might actually make a good bit of money because he would be a huge add for anybody defensively at least. So that will close things out here for us in our second segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. After the break, I'm going to go and discuss some of the best 3-team trades ever over the last few years and mention which teams were the winners and losers of those certain trades in the long run. It's been a lot of fun so far, but we got a lot more to go. So don't change that channel. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Great to have you all here still with me today, Jack Ridenauer again. And in the last segment, I discussed which big-name free agent has the best case to make for why they should make the most amount of money. And then I discussed which free agent I think it will be who gets paid the most. I want to now get into some of the most memorable and some of the best to date 3-team trades to occur, and who are the big winners and losers from those deals in the long run. So I want to jump right into it because there's been some crazy 3-team trades in the past. We had a couple 3-team trades go on during the trade deadline, if I'm not mistaken. A lot of different. I mean, that's always been something that's has really fascinated me in just sports in general, not just baseball, but in general, how these teams are able to work out deals amongst 3 teams. You know, I figure that the 2 teams, it's a lot easier to just say, hey, I'll give you guy X and guy Y, you give me guy X and prospect Y and Z, whatever it might be. And it's very simple. But the 3-team trade, that's where things really kind of get a little confusing and a little bit of wait, who's going where again and who's going to be getting who in return. A lot of different moving pieces. I couldn't imagine having to make those decisions. So to the people out there that are, my props to you, really, seriously. So the first one that I want to get into is Trevor Bauer going to Cincinnati. And I think that people might not realize, I mean, I vaguely remember when it came out that he was going to Cincinnati because it was a big blockbuster trade, if you will. Now, the teams that were involved were the Indians, obviously, because they were dealing Trevor Bauer, the Reds, of course, and then also the Padres. So the Reds got Trevor Bauer from Cleveland, and then the Padres got Taylor Trammell from Cincinnati, outfielder who's now with the Mariners. And then the Indians got Yasiel Puig from Cleveland, and then they also got Franmil Reyes from San Diego. They got Logan Allen from San Diego, Victor Nova from San Diego as well, and Scott Moss from Cincinnati. So the Indians got a slew of guys for giving up Trevor Bauer, which rightfully so. I mean, Bauer is, like I mentioned in the last segment, he's going to make a huge case for a lot of money this offseason. I mean, reigning NL Cy Young winner, kind of hard to argue with that. But going into this trade a little bit, and in all honesty, the Padres really, I think, suffered in this one. I mean, they wound up getting Taylor Trammell from the Reds, like I mentioned, but he's with the Mariners. He's not done a whole lot. I think that I don't even think he played this past year for the Mariners in one game. I think he's on the team, but I don't think he actually played any at all. And for the Indians, I mean, they're kind of the second team that got the raw end of the deal because Yasiel Puig, I think, played 1 year, if that, in Cleveland. He didn't play this past season, and now he's a free agent, and he batted below 270 in his one lone year in Cleveland. And, I mean, Reyes, coming from San Diego, he was actually a decent ad for the Indians. I mean, he batted above 275 this year. He had 9 home runs and 34 RBIs. So somebody that was definitely an added piece for them, you know, a really, really solid a get from this trade without question. And he's also had pretty solid numbers across the board in his career. So in all honesty, San Diego might have really lost a big-time potential, superstar. No, I don't want to say superstar because that might be a little bit aggressive to say, but Franmil Reyes is a nice player that I think a lot of teams would be very happy to have. And I definitely think the Padres, I don't know why they decided to get rid of him because I think he was probably after Bauer and probably Puig just because of his past and how he has been good in the past. I think Reyes was the next guy that was kind of the most vital for these teams. I mean, yeah, in 2019 he batted 249, but in 2018 batted 280, and not to mention in 2019 he had 37 homers and 81 RBIs. So San Diego gave up a huge power hitter from out of their lineup, and it's kind of a little bit shocking that they would give somebody up that was that good. Now, obviously, they have come full circle in a lot of ways with adding some of these players that they've been able to add, such as, obviously, Austin Nola, Mitch Moreland, and as time has gone on, they got rookies like Jake Cronenworth, Will Myers coming over in trades. So they obviously built up a team to where it is now, and it's a very good team. But definitely getting rid of Reyes is probably kind of a big blow for the Padres. Logan Allen has been okay for Cleveland. I mean, I don't think that he's been anything special, so the Indians didn't really get any great added pitching. And, he might have the potential to be a really good starter down the road, which I would say would be a huge get in the long run for the Indians because they do have a great pitching staff. But aside from that, Victor Nova hasn't done anything, and neither has Scott Moss. So the Indians, I think, really lost out here a little bit, although they did get Franmil Reyes. I mean, that's a big addition for them. Not to mention, he brings in really solid outfield hitting. And the Indians, as I've mentioned before, really struggled outfield-wise with the hitting. And so I think that Reyes is able to bring that up big time. I mean, he had a 795 OPS. He had 2 straight years of over 800 OPS in 2018 and 2019. He's got an 821 career OPS. So definitely had some, pretty solid years in the past couple seasons. I mean, this is only his second, third year in the league. So I think he's going to be an intriguing guy to look at down the road. I think he could definitely make some noise maybe, and maybe Logan Allen. But other than that, I mean, I think the Indians kind of, I don't think they really lucked out on this. I mean, Puig, he's probably going to be gone. Victor Nova hasn't done anything, and Scott Moss hasn't done anything. But the real loser in this one was without question the Padres. I mean, there was no question about it. And it's shocking to say that, but they don't even have Trammell on their team anymore. I mean, he's on the Mariners now, and they got rid of a solid outfield piece, like I mentioned, in Franmil Reyes, who has clearly shown he's a big league level hitter. And I think that he's got a lot of potential, and he's only had every single season that he's played, his OPS numbers, OPS plus numbers have all been above 100. Not to mention, when he was in San Diego, his OPS plus number was 121. He went to Cleveland, and it dropped down to 97. So right there, I mean, imagine if they had that added bat in the lineup this year. But I think that what is intriguing about Reyes is that he can also be a DH. So the Indians might actually really luck out in the long run having him on the roster. But the Padres walked away so empty-handed in this, and it's kind of unfortunate to see. But I think the winner of this trade, I mean, it was hard to pick because there wasn't a clear-cut winner, I would say. I would probably go with the Reds, mainly because they made the playoffs for the first time since 2013, and adding Bauer clearly helped their cause. But they were still disappointing because of the other additions that they had made in last year's offseason with Mike Moustakas and Nick Castellanos. And as a result, I think that they were probably the winner just because they seemed to clearly benefit the best with having, out of all of these additions that these teams had. I mean, Trammell clearly made no difference for the Padres. They still made the playoffs. They had plenty of guys on that team. And the Indians, I don't think that Reyes made that big of a difference either. I think that he, and Puig clearly didn't because he didn't even play. So I would say the winner is definitely the Reds, and the loser, obviously, the Padres, without question. So the next three-team trade that I want to get into that was a really, really wild one is Trey Turner actually going to the nation's capital and going and getting traded there. So, I mean, that's a huge move for them because, he was really good this past year. I mean, there's no question about it. I think that he was one of the better, players at the shortstop position this past season. And I think that when you've got a guy that is not only a great hitter, but he's also, a really good fielder. He's got great solid fielding numbers as well, but mainly the hitting, because you don't see that power hitting that you saw in Trey Turner this past year at that shortstop position. Usually your middle infielders aren't hitting like that. Now, obviously, it's a little bit of a trend in today's age of baseball that middle infielders, guys like that, are getting hits and are getting, big power hits and are having big power numbers. But ultimately, I mean, I think that Trey Turner is going to be, for quite some time, one of the better shortstop in the league. So getting into the trade, the teams that were involved, Nationals, obviously, the Padres, once again, and the Tampa Bay Rays. So the Nationals got Trey Turner from San Diego. And if you think about it, San Diego's had some very good players in their farm system. Whoever's running their minor league system is doing a incredible job, a superb job. So Trey Turner coming from the Padres. Padres got Will Myers from the Rays. They also got Ryan Hannigan from the Rays, Jose Castillo from the Rays, and Gerardo Reyes from the Rays. The Rays got Steven Souza Jr. from Washington. They got Jake Bowers from San Diego, Rene Rivera from San Diego, Bruce Smith from San Diego, and Travis Ott from Washington. And again, a little bit of a flop for San Diego. I mean, the guys that they got were not great, but they made up for it by, obviously acquiring Myers. Will Myers was a huge get for them and has continued to really pay dividends down the road as he was arguably one of the better hitters on the Padres team this past year. Great power numbers. And I think that he's going to be somebody that for years to come is going to be a highly, highly needed and just a highly sought after player in general. So Will Myers going to the Padres was definitely a big get, but the other guys, they haven't done anything. Hannigan hasn't really had a whole lot to show for. Castillo, the same thing. Reyes, the same thing. And so it's kind of like, all right, you got one guy, you gave up somebody like Trey Turner, who, in all honesty, kind of a Myers for Turner swap isn't so bad. I think it's fairly fair. It's not anything spectacular. But if you look at Will Myers' numbers, he's definitely got a lot of pop in his bat. I mean, his OPS has floated around high 700s for most of his career, and actually this past season he had a career high in OPS at 959. So clearly the Padres did get a big get in that one. But the Nationals getting Trey Turner, I mean, that was ginormous for their organization, especially when at that time, Ian Desmond was already out in Washington, and they lost that power-hitting shortstop that Desmond has been in his career and really was in Washington. But this year, it was a career year for Turner. 335 average, 12 homers, 41 RBIs, and not to mention, he's had at least 19 home runs in 2 of the last 3 seasons he's played. So clearly, I think that, San Diego did miss out on keeping Turner, but they would have had some serious competition at the shortstop position because they would have had Fernando Tatis and Trey Turner. Now, if you think about it, having both of them on the same team is not a bad thing, but you'd have to juggle around position-wise where they're going to go. So who knows what would have happened if they kept Turner. Definitely would have been a little bit of a fight over at shortstop. But maybe they would not have acquired Tatis. Maybe they would not have gone after him. Maybe they would have said, hey, we're sticking with Turner, and we're going to kind of see how this one unfolds. And I can only imagine if Turner was on this Padres lineup this past year, because it would have just been even heavier than it already was, because they had great hitting across the entire board. Myers, one of them right now, I'm looking at it, 40 RBIs and 15 home runs. Pretty substantial numbers, not to mention a 159 OPS plus. Had a career highs in OPS and OPS plus this past season. So the Padres did not quite lose like they did in the Bauer deal, but they definitely, I don't think, were the big winners. The Nationals clearly big-time winners from this, and the Rays, they just got nobody. They didn't get anybody that was anything special. I think that without question, Souza, he's never hit above 250 with the Rays. He actually batted 148 in 2020. So you get a guy that in 5 or 6 years turns out to be kind of disappointing. Bauer actually hasn't played in the major league since 2019. And then obviously, Ott, he hasn't done anything either. He's been non-existent, if that. And Rivera's worst year actually came the one season he was with Tampa Bay, and he batted 178. So the Rays have a couple guys that didn't even wind up finishing out with the Rays, a couple guys that aren't even in the league, and a couple guys that didn't even bat above 200. So this trade clearly did not work out for the Rays, but it definitely worked out for the Nationals. And not to mention, 2019, the Nationals won a World Series. That was a huge, I think, part of it, as having Trey Turner, that added bat in the lineup. Sure, they had other guys, but I think he was kind of an X factor, if you will, in the whole thing of it, because, obviously you had Juan Soto and his power hitting, and Anthony Rendon really highlighted that team. Howie Kendrick stepping up to the plate big time. You had all the pitching that was on the team as well. But when you have somebody like Turner who can be that difference maker from the plate, no question about it, was this a win for the Nationals. And I think that Turner, obviously, he's put up big-time numbers with the Nationals, and he's, like I mentioned, a World Series winner, slowly emerging as a top-hitting shortstop in the league. The loser, though, the Rays. Imagine if they had kept Will Myers around, and that's a big thing. They don't have much power hitting, and Will Myers brings power hitting. And actually, in his career, his best batting average season was in 2013, his rookie year with Tampa Bay. 13 homers and 53 RBIs, and an 831 OPS, and he had a 131 OPS plus. Both numbers are actually, at the time, before this past season, they were his career high numbers. So they gave up a big piece, I think. I think they gave up somebody that they should not have, and I could only imagine what their team would look like now if they had kept Myers around and maybe had him, stick around in the outfield, could have even moved him over to first base, could have moved him over to third base, whatever it might have been. But I think that losing out on Will Myers was definitely a big loss for the Rays. So the next trade I want to talk about is Didi Gregorius going to the Yankees. And this was a really, really big trade. Very small. Not a whole lot of guys involved. It was only between the D-backs, the Tigers, and the Yankees. The D-backs got Robbie Ray from Detroit. They also got Domingo Leiba from Detroit as well. And then the Tigers got Shane Green from New York, and the Yankees got Didi Gregorius from Arizona. So a pretty simple, standard trade, nothing crazy. But I think that there was a lot of winners in this, because when you think about it, Robbie Ray was an all-star after the fact, after he'd arrived in Arizona. And then Shane Green, the same thing. He also made an all-star team when he arrived in Detroit. And actually, he was an all-star in 2019. And then Gregorius, he's been a very strong hitter for the Yankees. And his average went from 226 his last year in Arizona, and then it skyrocketed almost 40 points up to 265 his first year in New York. So again, obviously not at 285, 300, where I think a lot of people would like him to be at, but having a 40-point increase in your average in just 1 year, I think that says a lot. And then again, the next year he actually went up to 276 in 2016, and then he had a 287 average after that. So definitely somebody that has had a nice career in New York, or had a nice career in New York because he wasn't with them this past season, and he continued that trend on into not only the time with the Yankees but also with the Phillies. And then Robbie Ray, I mean, they were just as good. Robbie Ray and Shane Green were just as good on their new teams. Green was actually an All-Star in 2019 with the Tigers, and then he wound up actually leaving and going to the Braves. And then his start there was a little rough. I mean, he had 3 seasons in Detroit where his ERA was 5 or above. So, from the jump, he wasn't awesome. But as time went on, he started to have a much better improvement. He wound up having a 2.30 ERA one year, and then also a 2.66 ERA another year. And then obviously Robbie Ray, he made a big impact in Arizona. He was an All-Star in 2017. It was actually his first year he arrived in Arizona that he was an All-Star. And then his ERA went from an 8.16 in 2014 with the Tigers to a 3.52 ERA his first year also in Arizona. So huge difference. I mean, you're dropping your ERA down 5 percentage points. That is hard to do, especially as a starter. And he gave some great pitching for Arizona, but I don't think any of these guys did anything drastic for their teams, right? None of these teams went deep into the playoffs per se. None of these teams, went far to a World Series. The Yankees had already won a World Series after the fact of getting Gregorius. And when you think about it now, Robbie Ray's not even with the Diamondbacks anymore. Didi Gregorius is not even with the Yankees anymore. And then Shane Green, the same thing. I mean, he's not with the Tigers anymore. So for the time that they were with these teams, they were productive, they were efficient, they were all-stars. Well, Gregorius wasn't, but the other two were. And then, obviously, you did have Gregorius giving a lot of beneficial, needed help in that lineup, especially hitting-wise. So I would say that the winner of this are all 3 teams. They won in one way or another. I mean, whether it was Gregorius having a lot of help, giving a lot of help to the Yankees hitting-wise, or Robbie Ray adding some deep pitching for the Diamondbacks, Shane Green being kind of the highlight for the Detroit Tigers. So I would say all of them really lucked out in this transaction, and it was a good, solid 3-way trade, but ultimately, it didn't really benefit anybody in the long run, but it was definitely still a solid trade across the board. And then the last 3-way trade that I want to discuss is Max Scherzer going to Detroit. Now, this was a really big one because, again, the D-backs, the Tigers, and the Yankees were all involved. And Max Scherzer went from Arizona to Detroit. Austin Jackson went from New York to Detroit, and then Phil Koch went from New York to Detroit as well. And also Daniel Schlereth, he went from Arizona to Detroit. And then the Yankees got Curtis Granderson from Detroit, and the Diamondbacks got Ian Kennedy from the Yankees and Edwin Jackson from the Tigers. So some big-time, well-known names in this transaction, obviously Scherzer being kind of the highlight, being a 2-time, 3-time Cy Young winner, an 8-time All-Star, whatever else he might be. So I think that really Arizona just missed out on this completely. I mean, he only had 37 starts total for the Diamondbacks, and for whatever reason, they let him go. They decided to trade him away, and I know he wasn't crazy productive in his first couple years in Arizona, and he was not the typical Max Scherzer that we all know, but he was still, I mean, if you think about it, some of these teams that have stuck with guys for years on end, it pays off. You give them a couple years to really work out the kinks a little bit, and I think you could have a huge, huge payoff. And if you look at actually his numbers from 2008 to 2009 when he was with the Diamondbacks, sure, his first year was not very good. He was 0-4. He did have a 3.05 ERA, and he had 66 Ks in 56 innings. So he wasn't terrible. He was okay. But then he improved in 2008 to 2009 by 9 wins. He was 9-11 in 2009. He had a 4.12 ERA, and then he had 174 Ks. So that increase simply from not only the strikeouts, but also from the wins. Now, he obviously did start in 30 games, as opposed to in 2008, he only started in 7 games. So his role expanded, no question. But if you look at his numbers as they continue to trend forward, I mean, he went up even more in wins. And then from, again, 2008 all the way to about 2013, his win total increases each year from 0 to 9, and then from 09 to 10, it was 9 to 12. And then he had an increase of wins from 2010 to 2011 of 3, and then from 2011 to 2012 he had another increase of wins by 1, and then he actually had a huge jump in wins from 2012 to 2013, going from 16 to 21, which was actually a career high of his. So they were a couple years away from having a Cy Young candidate all-star, pitcher. And for whatever reason, they decided to get rid of him, and the Tigers really lucked out in getting him. And not to mention, I think that the other guys that they got weren't that great. The Tigers did not really have any huge, maybe Austin Jackson. He was actually pretty solid for the Tigers without question. I mean, he batted above 270 for three of his first 4 years in Detroit. He actually led the AL in triples twice while he was there also. But the other two didn't really have much to offer. I mean, Schilling didn't do anything special, and Phil Koch was kind of on the tail end of his career. Now, the Yankees getting Curtis Granderson, I definitely think that was a solid get for them, because he did have 2 years in New York where he batted 40 home runs or more. He actually had a couple years in New York where he had over 100 RBIs. So they definitely benefited from having Granderson in a Yankees uniform, without a doubt. But I think the ultimate loser is the Diamondbacks. I mean, they picked up Edwin Jackson, who, again, was just a very average pitcher, I think, for most of his career, although he was around for quite some time, obviously did something right, but was not an all-star caliber pitcher, in my opinion. I think he was an all-star one time. They did get a no-hitter performance out of Edwin Jackson, so that is something to look at. But then Ian Kennedy didn't do anything himself. I don't think he was really much of a producer of anything, but it was definitely Granderson, having 2 years of huge power numbers. He led the AL in actually RBIs one year. He led the league in runs scored one season as well. Like I mentioned, two-time All-Star while he was with the Yankees. So Granderson experienced some really great years for the Yankees. And then obviously Scherzer, I mean, when he was in Detroit, he was a two-time All-Star, won 18 games one year. He won 21 games another year. He actually won a Cy Young in 2013, so his second to last year in Detroit. I think that it's fair to say that, the Tigers and Yankees really lucked out here, and the Diamondbacks, again, they just completely missed out. So I would say Yankees and Tigers are the winner of this one, and they got the most amount of production out of the players they traded for. And not to mention, one of them has continued on to being one of the top pitchers in baseball, and the Yankees did have some solid outfield hitting for a few years with Granderson, but the Diamondbacks really messed this one up, I think. They may have just gotten, a little impatient with Scherzer, I guess. I just don't know why they decided to get rid of him. He had such promise, and he had such a long-lasting career ahead of him, and he still has that career ahead of him. I don't understand why they got rid of him. And it's always interesting to see what these teams would have looked like if they had kept these players around. What kind of environment would be in Arizona right now? What would the winning culture be for the Diamondbacks if they had kept around guys like Max Scherzer and they had not gotten rid of guys like that? Same thing with, if you look at the Padres, if they had not unloaded the guys that they did for, Franmil Reyes or Trey Turner, what they would have looked like as teams. So it's always fun to kind of just sit and say, what if, this happened, what if that happened, just to kind of get an idea of, what these teams would look like today. It's always very fun to look at that. But anyways, that'll do it for this segment, folks. Again, thanks for sticking around. Really fun just discussing all the best three-team trades out there in the entire MLB and really over the last couple years. Stay right there, though, because we'll be right back after this commercial break for the final segment today, where I will still with the, we're going to stick with this conversation about trades in the past, because I want to now highlight some of the worst trades that I have ever seen in my life, but also some of the worst of all time. So don't go anywhere, everyone, because we've got one last segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Want to know the latest in soccer? Then listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast. From MLS, the World Cup, and the Premier League, we've got you covered. The latest updates, the hottest matches, and news on the league's top players. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast.
David Beckham scores the goal to take England all the way to the World Cup final.
Listen now.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for the final segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenauer still with you, and in the previous segment, I jumped right into discussing some of the best three-way trades and which were some of the most memorable transactions over the last few years, and also the big winners and losers of those deals. I want to now stick with that trade talk and discuss some of the absolute worst trades of all time, and I mean worst trades of all time, and what effect some of these trades had on these teams in the long run. So the first one I want to discuss, because I looked back at it. I was actually on Bleacher Report, and I like to look at Bleacher Report because whomever is coming up with these ideas and the content is very creative, and they always have very creative, topics and different kind of subject matter that they write about. And so I always like to kind of go to them and see what they're writing about and see if I can find ways to discuss it. And they had this huge list of about 50 of the worst trades in baseball history. So I went through, picked a couple that really stood out to me. One of them being this, actually Curt Schilling is the subject of a couple of these trades. And the first one was Curt Schilling being traded from the Orioles and then also eventually from the Astros. So Curt Schilling actually started his career in Baltimore. He was then traded to Houston and then obviously traded to Philadelphia, which then, again, he gets traded to Arizona, and the rest is history. So the other players that were involved in this initial deal with the Orioles and the Astros were Pete Harnisch. He was traded to Houston with Schilling. Glenn Davis, he was also traded to Baltimore for Schilling. And then Steve Finley was traded to Houston with Schilling as well. So if you look at that, I mean, the Orioles got just about nothing for a future Hall of Fame pitcher who was a Cy Young finalist, a World Series winner, and a multiple-time All-Star. And not to mention he also did win a couple World Series. So to the life of me, I just did not understand why Baltimore and why some of these teams, because I mentioned it briefly in the last segment, it's almost like these teams get impatient with these players and they don't take time to try and groom them. And then they get rid of them and all of a sudden some other team picks them up, they work with them, and they have incredible Hall of Fame careers. And it was just not a smart move for Baltimore to get rid of Curt Schilling. And I know you probably could not guess based on early on whether or not he was going to be good or not, but I just don't understand why you go after guys that, were pretty much non-effective for the teams that they were traded to. I mean, initially, Schilling was actually not very effective for Baltimore or Houston. He was initially a relief guy, went on to Philadelphia, and when he went to Philadelphia, that's where he really started to come into his own. I mean, 3 All-Star seasons there, and then obviously, he continued on into Arizona, where he was a Cy Young finalist a couple years, won a World Series with them, so on and so forth. And Finley, he was okay. Steve Finley was all right for Houston. Harnisch was actually an all-star one year in Houston, so he did kind of give some sort of benefit for the Astros. And then Glenn Davis only played 3 years in Baltimore. So Baltimore definitely struggled after Schilling left. Wasn't until 1996 that they made the playoffs again. So I don't want to call it a curse, but you could say that was the Curt curse because they really struggled after that. And it was no improvement at all, adding Glenn Davis. And sure, you got rid of, a couple guys that maybe at the time weren't doing a whole lot. But again, Harnisch went on to be an all-star. Schilling went on to have a Hall of Fame career. And Baltimore was left with a guy that was out of Baltimore in 3 years. So that's the first trade that really stuck out to me that I just did not understand it. The next one was a little bit further, down the road when the Mets actually wound up trading away Amos Otis to the Royals for Joe Foy. Now, the other players that were involved besides Joe Foy, which he was also traded to New York, was Bob Johnson, who was traded to Kansas City with Otis. And to the life of me also, I don't understand why, they traded him away. I mean, sure, I can maybe see it. After his first 2 years in his career, Otis was actually hitting below 230, so he was not very good in the beginning. But he goes over to New York, and then all of a sudden his average jumps up to 280 and higher for his first 4 years in Kansas City. And so I think that's kind of the big thing was, in New York, he was not very good. He goes over to Kansas City, plays 14 productive, very good years. He's a 5-time All-Star. I believe he was a 3-time Gold Glover, a 3-time Silver Slugger. So he had a very decorated career for Kansas City. And actually, during that time of period, Kansas City was an expansion team. And they had, I believe, I'd have to get double-checked on this, or somebody would have to fact-check me on this, but they had one of the longest or one of the most successful 10-year runs in any expansion team's history. And Otis was a part of all of that, really. I mean, he was a huge part of that. And he actually wound up, what was actually kind of interesting was that Otis won a World Series with the Mets right before he got out of New York in 1969. But then again, after that year and winning in 1969, and then Otis winds up getting traded and dealt, the Mets wouldn't finish higher than with 83 wins over the next couple seasons. So they did go on to win, a World Series a few years later in 1973. So it wasn't terrible for them. But imagine if they had kept Otis around. Imagine how many more World Series they would have won. Not just in 69 or not just in 73. Could have won in 75. Could have won in 77. They could have continued on that trend. And who knows? They might have been able to win against the Pittsburgh Pirates in 1979, I believe it was. So I think that, and I would have to get double-checked on that also, actually, now that I think about it, might have been the Orioles that played them in 79, but I'd have to look that up. But anyways, Otis leaving New York, I think, definitely was detrimental to them, even though they still won a World Series and whatnot. Kansas City clearly was very successful with him. I mean, I think he actually wound up retiring right before they went to the World Series in 1985. So he got his World Series ring, but he did not get it with the team that he really made a career with. So another trade that I think really kind of fell through for the Mets, even though they still won World Series, but they got rid of a very talented player. So the next trade, we're going back to Curt Schilling because this is where he was traded from Philadelphia to Arizona. Now, the other players that were involved in this deal were Travis Lee. He was traded from Arizona to Philadelphia. Omar Dahl, he was traded to Philadelphia. Nelson Figueroa, he was traded to Arizona, he was traded from Arizona to Philadelphia. And then Vicente Padilla, he was traded from Arizona to Philadelphia also. Now, this is the second time at this point that Schilling, maybe even the third time, Schilling had been dealt for what would turn out to be a really bad deal for the Phillies. I mean, Schilling, he was a huge difference maker for the Diamondbacks. Again, finished second in the Cy Young voting 2 times while he was with the D-backs. He won 58 games over his 4 years in the desert. He won a World Series with them in 2001 that, to this day, is probably one of the most memorable World Series wins by any expansion team ever. And he was a 2-time All-Star. Not to mention he won 20-plus games on 2 separate occasions while he was in Arizona. And he had a season where he had over 300 Ks. So I think Arizona definitely lucked out. I mean, whoever was their front office people in that situation, going after Curt Schilling, going after Randy Johnson, who I actually believe, if I'm not mistaken, he was traded from the Montreal Expos over to Arizona, or he was traded from Houston over to Arizona, one of the two. He was traded over to Arizona as well, and they really formed kind of this just dynamic tandem that I kind of relate, like, in today's age, if Trevor Bauer, kind of going back to free agency talk, if Trevor Bauer landed on the New York Mets and it was DeGrom and Bauer, and kind of that deal. Obviously Johnson is the better pitcher and career-wise, obviously, same thing with DeGrom, but Schilling is right there as an incredible, in a lot of cases probably would have been an ace for many teams, similar to Bauer. Still very good, but just not quite to that level. So it's very curious to kind of see how these teams would have unfolded if they had kept these guys around. Obviously, I think Philadelphia would have really benefited from it. They wound up going to a World Series one year, but they lost to the Blue Jays. So I'm sure in that instance they could have definitely benefited from some great pitching in that situation against the Blue Jays. And honestly, the other guys on this involved in this trade, they didn't really do anything. They didn't do anything at all. Travis Lee was a very average. I think he was very injury-ridden during his time in Philadelphia. So Phillies really, missed out on an opportunity to keep Schilling. And for whatever reason, it was the Arizona Diamondbacks that decided to keep Schilling around the longest or keep him around at the right time, and it really paid off for them the best way. So the next trade and next kind of deal I want to get into, which, again, this team has been subject to some of the worst trades, especially in the last couple of years. And this is when the Pirates decided to trade away Aramis Ramirez over to the Cubs. Now, the other players involved were Kenny Lofton. He was traded to Chicago with Ramirez. Matt Bruback, he was traded to Pittsburgh. Jose Hernandez was traded to Pittsburgh. And Bobby Hill was traded to Pittsburgh. So you hear those last 3 names, and you say, who are those guys? And Kenny Lofton was on the tail end of his career. I think he only played like 3 seasons after the fact, maybe 2 with the Pirates, and then he wound up retiring. But Aramis Ramirez with the Cubs, I mean, Lofton was with the Cubs, not the Pirates. But Ramirez really was the key focal point and the center factor in this entire thing. I mean, Ramirez was at one point or another one of the best third basemen in the entire league. He was one of the best hitting third basemen in the entire league. And this is not the first time that Pittsburgh has made questionable moves. I mean, back when they went and got Chris Archer from the Rays, they gave up Tyler Glasnow and they gave up Austin Meadows. Well, both of those players were just in the World Series just not too long ago. So that tells you how much thought went into that trade. And not to mention, yeah, Chris Archer was good coming into Pittsburgh, but he's been injury-ridden the entire time. He's either gotten incredibly rocked or he'll strike out 7 guys in 5 innings. It's hit or miss. He's either getting home runs getting belted on him or, again, striking guys out left and right. And that was just a terrible, terrible move for them. Then they also got rid of Garrett Cole, who would go on to have Cy Young caliber seasons, win a World Series. So they've been subject to some very poor moves in baseball history, without question. And I think that this was kind of the beginning of the end for the Pirates front office at the time. I really do, because this is kind of just the first piece of, poor decision-making in a front office fashion. And I think that, obviously getting rid of Ramirez is one thing, but getting rid of Cole and then getting rid of Meadows and getting rid of Glasnow, and then all of those guys, they leave and they just flourish. And it makes you wonder what's going on within the Pirates. What's going on with their development? Why are these guys not having great years with the Pirates? They leave, and then they all of a sudden have Cy Young caliber seasons. They're all-stars. I mean, Ramirez went on to become an all-star 2 times. He batted over 300 the next 2 years with Chicago after he was traded, and he was a Silver Slugger, also in Chicago. And the Pirates got, again, no help. I mean, they got absolutely no help in this deal. Cubs were not great when Ramirez was there. They weren't the World Series contending team like in recent memory, but the Pirates were even worse. I mean, they had a series of 5th to 6th place finishes in the NL Central after his departure. So I don't think, Ramirez would have made a huge difference, but you could have at least waited a couple years, try to get a couple better pieces and maybe some better draft selections or whatever it might have been, whatever incentive they could have gotten for somebody that would go on to become an all-star multiple times, bat above 300, really had a very, very good bat for many, many years. And the Pirates missed out on that. If they kept him around, you keep Garrett Cole around, you've got all of a sudden a totally different team. And then you obviously at one point or another had Andrew McCutchen and so on and so forth. You had some very good, Russell Martin. You had some good pieces that, those couple playoff runs they had in the early 2010s, who knows? It might have turned out to be a little bit better. Now, Ramirez was obviously on his tail end of his career during that time, but still, you would have been able to at least trade him maybe a couple years before that for some better pieces. But they did not decide that. They did not think that out, and as a result, the Pirates really suffered, and they're still kind of suffering to this day. So the next couple trades are kind of interesting, but this one is really interesting. Dave Winfield being traded for literally dinner. Yes, he was literally traded for dinner. The deal was this. The Twins decided to trade Winfield, and this was at the tail end of his career, Hall of Famer, 12-time All-Star, won a couple World Series, I think, with the Yankees. Very good player. Winds up getting traded to the Cleveland Indians from the Minnesota Twins. What they did was this. The Twins, I think in the deal, they had mentioned that they were going to be players named at a later date in the transaction. But in 1994, there was a player strike. And so at the end of the 1994 season, I believe it was August 12th, I think it was something like that, they stopped playing baseball. And they did not continue on until April 2nd, I think, of 1995. So almost a whole year, there was no baseball. So Winfield actually wound up never even playing for the Indians. And in return, the Indians front office got taken out to dinner by the Minnesota Twins front office. Not quite sure why two teams would do that. I don't know why. I mean, Winfield literally was on his last leg of his career. I'm pretty sure his stop in Cleveland was the last season he played, in like 1995 or 1996. So really didn't get a whole lot out of Winfield, and I don't think you were going to because he was, again, aging and getting ready to retire. So you got a free meal out of it for, giving up a guy that's a future Hall of Famer. Now, I think I felt like this is kind of a neutral deal just because nobody really won, nobody really lost. I mean, you got a free meal out of it, so that's cool, and the Indians got an aging Hall of Famer that they can say played for them for a year, so I guess that's kind of a benefit, but neither team really drastically benefited from having him come and obviously, or even getting rid of him, and obviously they didn't have a World Series, so they could not really gauge whether or not Winfield could have been a difference maker for them making a World Series. Now, a couple years later, the Indians do make a World Series. They lose to the Marlins, but still, it doesn't matter because Winfield would not have made a difference. He would have been retired by that point. So just something interesting that I saw that a player was literally traded because I don't think a player was ever named eventually. So they just said, to heck with it. We're going to just take you out to dinner because of this player strike. So, who knows what would have happened if Winfield had been traded earlier on in his career. So the last two I want to discuss, two of the more infamous trades, if you will. Red Sox dealing Babe Ruth to the Yankees. As we all know, there was nobody involved other than Babe Ruth and some cash. And this is probably the most memorable trade ever. I mean, it started the Bambino curse. It was an 86-year-long curse for the Red Sox. And Babe Ruth went on to have, again, an incredibly decorated career. 13 seasons with over an 1,100 OPS. From the early 1920s, from about 1922, or from 1920 to 1934, so 14-year span, never batted below 300 except for 2 years. So 12 out of 14 years from the time that you get traded to the Yankees and on, you bat above 300 at least, and you have 13 of those seasons with over an 1,100 OPS. Not just in 1,000, but 1,100 OPS. If you go on Baseball Reference and you look at Babe Ruth's numbers, you'll notice that he was only a two-time All-Star, and I believe he was an MVP once. I don't think back in those days they really took to heart the accolades and things like that. I don't think it was that big of a deal back then. But his numbers, wow. I mean, you look at his numbers, and it's almost just video game-like. I mean, he had a 1,300 OPS a couple times. He had a 1,200 OPS numerous times. So somebody that, again, eventually would become the home run king for quite some time before that record is broken by Hank Aaron. But and a little side fact about this, actually, I was doing some research because I was very curious, how do they know that Babe Ruth broke a record, or how do they know he even set a record? Well, the reason why they know this is this. There was never anybody else before Babe Ruth that hit major home run numbers. There was one guy named Roger Connor, and Roger Connor was an interesting individual, and here is why. He was the only one that anybody ever kept track of their home run numbers, and as a result, they only kept up to about, I think he was at 138 when he retired. So his home run numbers were at 138. Babe Ruth, again, had some incredible seasons. He had one year in 1927. He had 60 home runs. And he wound up beating and breaking that record of 139. And then you think about it, he set a record that was at 714. 714 home runs. So he absolutely demolished the record from before. And I didn't expect it to be very high, but 138 home runs. First off, I was actually kind of shocked that somebody knew that, and that information was out there. I was afraid that I was not going to be able to find it, but lo and behold, I did, and it was just kind of interesting to see him, the career he would go on to have with the Yankees. Won numerous World Series with them. I mean, numerous. I think he won about 7 or 8 with them. In the 1920s, the Yankees literally reigned supreme in baseball. I mean, they called them Murderers Row for a reason, and that really kind of set things back for the Red Sox. And until about a couple years ago, now a little bit further than a couple years ago, but they eventually broke the curse. But it was a long time, and I definitely think that it's a trade that is not really talked about in Red Sox fan households at all, because I wouldn't want to talk about it either, because that is just a very, very bleak time, I think, in Boston Red Sox history. So the last trade I want to discuss that I think is just one of the worst trades ever is Lou Brock going from the Cubs to the Cardinals. A division rival, you're getting a guy that, yeah, okay, at the time, he wasn't really doing a whole lot. I mean, he did not have incredible numbers with the Cubs, but then he would go on to have, a Hall of Fame career, 6-time All-Star. He led the NL or MLB in steals 8 different times while with the Cardinals. And again, he won. I mean, they traded him, and the year he gets traded to the Cardinals, they win a World Series. And then a couple years later, they won another World Series. So they won 2 World Series in a span of 5 years from the point that they acquired Brock to the time that, a 5-year span from the time he was acquired to when they won their World Series, or in his time, in his career with the Cardinals, the last World Series, they won 2 of them. So not too shabby of a job by the Cardinals front office then, going after by somebody like that. Now, the Cubs, I don't know why they were doing this. I had no idea why they did this. The other players that were involved were Jack Spring, he was traded to St. Louis with Brock. Paul Toth, he was traded to St. Louis as well with Brock. And then you had Ernie Broglio, he was traded to the Cubs. Doug Clemens, he was dealt to the Cubs as well, and then Bobby Shantz as well. So you didn't really have anybody that had spectacular careers necessarily. And imagine if the Cubs had kept around Lou Brock, because at one point or another, a couple years later, the Cubs would have had Ron Santo, future Hall of Famer, Ernie Banks, Mr. Cub, future Hall of Famer, and also Lou Brock, all at the same time in 1967, which the Cubs actually only finished 3rd. So if they had kept Brock, imagine if he was the difference maker to them making the playoffs and going to a World Series or not. And like the Red Sox, they also had a very long-standing curse that still stood up until about 4 or 5 years ago. So I think this was just one of many instances where the Cubs kind of shot themselves in the foot a little bit by getting rid of a guy that would literally hold the all-time base-stealing record for years. I mean, years. And you look at some of his numbers. He actually had one year when he was 35. He had 118 stolen bases. That was his career high when he was 35. He retired at 40. He was an all-star at 40. So the guy was just unbelievable, even into his later years in baseball. And I think the Cubs really missed out on that. So the Cardinals were a big-time winner for that one. But overall, some really just foolish moves by some of these teams. I mean, obviously, Curt Schilling just being dealt around all over the place. And lo and behold, he lands in the most unlikely place in Arizona on an expansion team and takes them to a World Series. Then you've obviously got the Mets getting rid of Otis, but they wound up winning a World Series, so it wasn't that bad. But still, I mean, they missed out on a 5-time All-Star and someone who played very well in his career. And then the Pirates, just very moronic moves for them. Winfield getting traded for just a night out. And then obviously, Babe Ruth and Lou Brock being dealt from their original teams to really rivals. I mean, Babe Ruth was on the Red Sox. He gets traded to the Yankees, a rival. And then Lou Brock was on the Cubs, gets traded to the Cardinals, a rival. So you think about it, and it's like, were they kind of just giving up and just giving the enemy their most coveted possession? I don't know. I mean, it's kind of puzzling, but I guess you can't really gauge, the outcome or the outlook of a player for years to come. Although Babe Ruth did put up some great numbers with the Red Sox for a little while, and then all of a sudden, he just exploded for the Yankees. So I don't think you could have been able to tell the future on that one, and the same thing with Lou Brock. So you can't really hold these teams in too much fault, but at the same time, you can't really give them the benefit of the doubt because they could have just kept on to some of these guys who were actually having good years on their teams. And if you stuck out with them, then maybe you'd have yourself a World Series championship or a couple extra, league pennants or whatever it might be. But regardless, some foolish moves, but some great additions for some very historic teams that really paid off very well for them down the road. So that'll wrap it up for us here today, folks. Thanks again for listening to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review that really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, we'd really appreciate that. Just want to keep everybody clued in and up to date on all of the latest and greatest news going around the MLB world. So thanks again, everyone, for joining me today, and as always, have a great day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.